Ahiai Mahere, welcome back this afternoon, and we'll continue on with section 42A authors. Thank you.
Wait, I pressed it too. Oh, sorry.
Excellent.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Angelina. I'm also the Section 42A and Addendum Report author for the energy and infrastructure topic. And this presentation outlines key matters in the energy and infrastructure chapter with EI in short. This is a values-based chapter of the proposed plan. And it addresses infrastructure within the CMA, including renewable energy generation. Submissions received on the chapter are primarily lodged by infrastructure providers, and based on the submissions and evidence received, key issues in contention include the approach to managing adverse effects of national grid activities in significant areas, and the policy framework for development areas.
Can I just hold you a moment? Is Mr. Rice, I don't think we've got your present. This is one we haven't got, I don't think. Can I just mention, Mr. Rice, we don't have this one. I think we've got.
There's 2 or 3. We've jumped from 10 to about 14.
It's useful.
No, I'll just...
Yeah, so I don't think we've got you on. We'll just hold a minute more. I think this looks like the only one we don't have, I think, isn't it? Yeah. Structures. Yeah, I think it's just this one we don't have. Ms. Wang, I think we'll keep going because we've got it up on the screen. We'll just get Mr. Rice to send it through, just so we've got it, because it's always good to have it here to see where it's going. But just keep going.
Okay, yeah,
Thank
sounds
you.
good. I don't have any pictures, so no point in zooming in. So these outstanding matters, they were discussed at the EI as part of the planning. They were discussed at the EI conferencing session on 2nd of December. And they are also addressed in the Section 42A Addendum Report. So to cover off the basics, the EI chapter reflects policy direction in the National Policy Statement for renewable electricity generation, the EPS for electricity transmission, and the NZCPS. This chapter is a values-based chapter and it doesn't contain rules. The single objective and the 7 policies, including the additional 3 policies recommended to be inserted, are implemented through activity rules in other chapters of the proposed plan, notably rules that apply to regionally significant infrastructure and development areas. The EI chapter is accompanied by the development areas map layer, which includes the areas already consented by the EPA at Te Ariki Tahi Sugarloaf Wharf and Kopu Marine Precinct. In submissions, there were 5 key matters raised. The first matter is considered resolved. This was discussed during expert conferencing with the planning expert from Waikato District Council, who confirmed he no longer seeks any further changes regarding the provision for locally significant infrastructure. The second matter, several submitters expressed concern regarding the potential adverse effects of offshore wind farms. The Section 42A report recommends no amendments are made because when read as a whole, constraints for offshore wind farms and their potential effects are considered adequately addressed in other chapters. I do want to note that since the proposed plan was notified in 2023, Blue Float Energy have decided to cease development of its offshore wind portfolio in New Zealand, and no submitted evidence was received on offshore wind farms. However, it could still be a matter in contention as the Waikato West Coast remain a potential location for other offshore wind developers. The third matter relates to development areas. The Section 42A report recommended that the EIP 6 is retained as notified, which seeks to enable activities in development areas. Thames Coromandel District Council pointed out in their submission that the map layer doesn't reflect the consents issued for Sugarloaf Wharf and Kopu Marine Precinct, and the Section 42A report accordingly recommended the map layer is amended to include these areas already consented. A key matter in contention remains regarding whether development areas should be included in the proposed plan's definition of regionally significant infrastructure, and accordingly whether the definition for development areas should be amended too. This is requested by TCDC through their submission and also addressed through expert conferencing. And I will explain this issue in further detail shortly. The fourth matter concerns giving effect to the MPS for electricity transmission. Transpower lodged an extensive submission and the EI Section 42A and addendum reports recommended a number of changes, including amendments to the overview, EI Objective 1, Policy 2 and Policy 3 to include specific recognition and provisions relating to electricity transmission. I also recommended new definitions for electricity transmission network and the national grid, and these amendments are supported by Transpower. However, the key policy framework sought by Transpower is a seek to avoid policy specific for the national grid. In response to this submission, the Section 42A report proposed 2 new policies. Council and Transpower reached agreement on EIP 5, which seeks to recognise and provide for the benefits of the national grid. However, P6 remains a matter of contention. Before I discuss EIP 6 in more detail, a related matter is the new policy EIP 6A in response to submissions seeking a similar management framework to the national grid but applying to RSI. And EIP 6A seeks to provide a pathway for RSI that may adversely affect outstanding natural character and outstanding natural features and landscapes. Following expert conferencing, the wording of EIP 6A have been agreed by experts representing Chorus, Spark, PowerCo and NZTA, and this matter is now considered to be resolved. So yes, Transpower sought to bespoke seek to avoid policy framework specific for managing adverse effects of national grid activities. They also sought for this policy to prevail over other conflicting policies. The EIP 6 policy is a key policy in the proposed plan that gives effect to the MPS for electricity transmission, particularly Policy 8. After further consideration of post-expert conferencing, including of legal advice, I am now in agreement with Transpower that although Policy 8 uses the term rural environments, this policy can and does apply to the CMA. The phrase seek to avoid, used in Policy 8, is also retained in the drafting of EIP 6, but to resolve potential uncertainties associated with its interpretation, Clause 4 of the policy of EIP 6 specifies this to mean where every possible effort has been made to avoid adverse effects, and it is not practicable to avoid adverse effects. However, in rebuttal evidence, Transpower considers this to create a high threshold. The intention of EIP 6 is to provide a pathway for the development of the national grid in high-value areas. And this responds to the recent Supreme Court decisions in Port Otago, and in particular the East-West link, where the court found there is room for deserving exceptions to avoid policies in the CPS. EIP 6 therefore restricts the national grid from locating in the CMA unless there is a functional or operational need. A key matter of contention for EIP 6 is whether the scope of this policy should be limited to values in areas of natural character and natural features and landscapes, or should this policy and this seek to avoid approach also apply, as sought by Transpower, to historic heritage, sites and area of significance to Māori, and nationally and regionally significant surf breaks. Another matter in contention relates to the policy framework for development areas. The proposed plan applies a bespoke policy framework for development areas, and following expert conferencing, the EI addendum report recommend adding development areas to 3 additional provisions, being Eco R11, Eco P7, and STR P9, and I've made Eco R13 in bold in asterisks because I would like to recommend development areas added to Eco R13 as well, because it complements the suite of provisions. And TCDC is supportive of these additions. TCDC, however, maintains that both Sugarloaf Wharf and Kopu Marine Precinct meet the definition of RSI. In the EI addendum report, I outline why I don't consider the legal opinion sought by TCDC as part of the EPA consent application as determinative for the coastal plan, and I understand we're going to get a further legal opinion on that too. But in potential inclusion of the Sugarloaf Wharf and the Kopu Marine Precinct in the definition of RSI also raises the question whether the plan's policy framework for RSI should apply to these areas. In the table on screen, you can see the key differences between the policy framework lies primarily in activity rules, and the main differences in activity status between development areas and RSI lies for disturbances of natural material, the removal of indigenous vegetation, and moorings. And in my opinion, it would be more appropriate to determine which policy, and specifically rule framework for development areas, need amendment rather than adding development areas to the definition of RSI, because this may create unintended consequences. This concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you for that. Are there any questions? Thank you. No other questions. I think there's some detail to be working out through this, and we'll hear the evidence from the submitters to see where this one ends up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Got this one. Saw it. So let's go back through. Kia ora, welcome back. Oh.
Kia ora anō tātou. So my name is Mariana, and just providing a brief summary on key matters in relation to historic heritage. So the chapter, Historic Heritage proposes to include provisions to identify and protect historic heritage from adverse effects of use and development. So the chapter includes a new schedule identifying historic heritage sites, as well as Schedule 12, which relates to accidental discovery protocol, and a historic heritage map layer as well. In terms of key issues that remain in contention, this includes the scheduling of sites in Schedule 5, the need for separate policies regarding the different heritage items, and the consideration of the activity status of HHR1. So I just wanted to speak briefly about to Schedule 5, given that it is a matter remaining in contention. So it was noted before that we are working with imperfect information, and this is certainly the case for the scheduling of heritage sites. And this is due to the dynamic nature of natural processes in the CMA, which complicates the mapping and location of these sites. So Schedule 5 is organised into 3 subcategories, and this is based on the visibility or the visibility of the sites. So 5A is heritage structures, 5B is heritage sites, and 5C is shipwrecks. And just acknowledging that crossover with with Schedule 6, that there are some sites identified, some cultural sites identified in Schedule 6 that's also scheduled in Schedule 5. In terms of key matters raised in submissions, these are still the key matters that remain in contention as well. And so, as I touched briefly on before, some submitters sought to schedule only sites that have been ground truthed and supported by the significance assessment. There's also submissions, and this is from Heritage New Zealand, seeking to have separate policies for built heritage sites and archaeological sites. And then some of the other submissions was just seeking minor amendments to use appropriate terminology and provide clarity on the application of the provisions themselves. In terms of recommendations, so in response to Heritage New Zealand's submission point, there was an overview there was an amendment in the overview to recognise that some historic heritage sites may be located partly in the CMA or adjoining, or land adjoining the CMA, and that's just recognising that cross-boundary integration, and also noting that integrated management should be considered here. There are minor amendments just to tighten up the terminology and the application of the historic heritage provisions where necessary. And just in regards to Schedule 5, just making minor amendments just to correct some errors. And also including the recording numbers in the map layer for referencing. In terms of matters remaining in contention, so I've noted Heritage New Zealand up there, and so they're seeking that only sites that have been ground truthed and accompanied with assessment of significance should be included in Schedule 5. In brief, Council did consider that during the development of the plan, but just deemed it was unfeasible due to the high costs and unknown time commitments. I also will mention that Kathy O'Callaghan, on behalf of TCDC in her rebuttal evidence, also noted that in regards to the schedule, it lacks location information, and so it's difficult for local authorities in particular to know where these sites are. We did at some stage of the compiling of Schedule 5 have a column which indicated some of that location, but when we went to go include it in the plan, we couldn't fit it all on the page, so that column was removed. However, that information is in the map layer, or proximate location is in the map layer itself. In terms of the second point, Heritage New Zealand is seeking that we have separate policies for archaeological sites and separate policies for heritage sites. My response is that the proposed plan treats both heritage and archaeological sites as part of the broader category of historic heritage. And this aligns with the RPS and the NZCPS. The provisions are worded broadly to consider all heritage items, and just noting as well that any activities require the authorisation from Heritage New Zealand, so the appropriate considerations given there as well. The final matter, so Heritage New Zealand seek to elevate the activity status of HHR1 from permitted to restricted discretionary status. My understanding is that their concern here was about compliance, given that that rule is a permitted activity rule. My response to that is that I don't think elevating the activity status will address that issue. If anything, it just creates a double consenting requirement. And that concludes my presentation. Happy to take questions.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Just one, kia ora. Just in relation to, I'm just looking at the recommended provisions in Schedule 5, and so most of them we've got the data source or reference and the ID, and then in that ID column we've got location not mapped, so that obviously they won't be in the showing. You just said before you took the location column out of some of the schedules.
Some of them, yes.
Yeah, but where you don't have a location, they won't be able to find it on the map, will they?
No, I don't believe so.
So there's a number of them there that we don't know the exact location.
No. I did seek some advice from our consenting team on this matter, this particular matter. He did outline a process I'm happy to share now, or I can provide later. So their first step would be to conduct a desktop review using the latest available spatial information. Secondly, where there is a potential overlap, they would then request further assessment from the applicant regarding the heritage risks, and also including potential engagement with iwi and Heritage New Zealand. And then the last is that they would include appropriate consent conditions such as the accidental discovery protocol, cultural monitoring, and pre-work site inspection when required.
Couple of questions. Thank you for that. A couple of questions for me. Just can you remind us? I haven't gone back and read the 42A specifically in relation to this hearing. I have read it. How different is the proposed plan from the operative plan in terms of the level of identification, the issues you raised about mapping and the whole ground truthing issue? Because I understand the council's position, that it's probably hellishly expensive to go out and actually identify where these things are. But we need to preface that on the basis that someone is saying, well, we don't even know where these things are, really. So how different is this from the operative plan?
So the schedule is it's new.
That's right, yeah.
And I think from our perspective is if we were to remove all the sites, then there wouldn't be any protection of them.
Yeah.
And so
I suppose the question I put to you professionally, do you think there is sufficient identification that an applicant or someone proposing to do something would be able to broadly identify where a potential historic site is?
I think in regards to the shipwrecks, that would be very difficult.
Oh, right.
And so I think that will be something that's factored into the consenting process and going, we've got limited information, then we can't compel the applicant to then do a thorough assessment. But we do have that accidental discovery protocol as well, which then is put in place just in case anything's discovered.
Remind me, other than Pohere Tonga, Heritage New Zealand raising submissions, how many other submitters are there raising this issue?
So there was TCDC,
Yeah.
and I think Waikato District Council was the other submitter. There might have been one
Right,
other.
so there's not that many, that's what I was remembering. And Pohere Tonga's lodged a statement of evidence, Mr. Pix, I think, is it?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think they're going to attend. I think his statement says, I think these can be all sorted out on the paper. And so I presume you've gone through his list. And can you just again remind me of what he set out in his evidence? How much of that did you agree with? I know you've got matters in contention. Were some of the matters that you agreed with, or don't agree with any of what he said? I mean, I can go back and have a look, but because they're not going to come, so we're not going to have them before us.
From my reading is, I think the outcomes are still the same. It was just, actually, and this is my opinion.
Which is good, that's what I'm after.
Yeah. So, for example, with the submitter seeking separate policies, in my opinion, I didn't see where the outcome would be different if we created the policies.
Right.
My concern with removing the sites would be that there's no protections, and I didn't get a response from the submitter in terms of what they were then proposing we could do.
No, that's helpful. Thank you. Thank you for that. Nothing further? Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, panel. So moorings, in brief, we thought this might attract more submissions than it did. However, it was quite a small number of submissions on this particular topic. So moorings have been dealt with as a discrete chapter separate from structures. In my opinion, I think most, if not all, matters are now resolved. The only evidence that was received on this was from Stormhaven's experts, planning and coastal scientists, and that was really to support the provisions. One of the key issues that did come up in, I guess, submissions is ensuring that areas like Slipper Island have sufficient anchoring and mooring facilities, particularly where it's the only means of access. And Slipper Island's unique in that it contains some quite substantial areas of seagrass beds, which are Civer A areas under the plan. And I'll just come to that in the last slide. This is a chapter which is substantially different from the operative plan because it actually proposes to establish a licensing regime through the Navigation and Safety Bylaw and under the Marine Transport Act rather than through the plan. So the whole idea is that rather than a mooring owner needing to get a resource consent every time they wish to put in a mooring, that actually occurs through the Navigation and Safety Bylaw of the Council. Clearly that can only deal with navigation and safety related matters, so that is one particular matter. Interestingly, there were no submissions opposing that particular shift in policy direction. So the plan itself then has a series of provisions that obviously clearly say that if you're in a mooring area, it's a permitted activity, and then outside of a mooring area, you need a resource consent, and clearly in areas that are prohibited from mooring, that activity is prohibited. So those mooring areas have been in place in the operative plan, mooring areas have been in place in the operative plan, as well as prohibited mooring areas. What is set out in Schedule 2 are either those same mooring areas reconfirmed, or amended areas, or new areas. And just going back, and it's part of the Section 32 record, but there was liaison and engagement with mooring owners and through the maritime team at the council in terms of what areas are appropriate for moorings, what new areas might be created and what amendments might be necessary. So one of those is at Cook's Beach, where I think from memory there's about 23 mooring consents. It's not a mooring area as such, but is regularly used over the summer period, particularly from those boaties that don't wish to use the boat ramp on a daily basis, and they just have their boat moored offshore at a particular part of Cook's Beach. So the advice from the maritime team was better to make that a mooring area. They could then manage it under the Navigation and Safety Bylaw. Also just to note that the moorings chapter addresses anchoring, and there has been submissions on the definition of anchoring. There has been a topic that came up, as well as concerns about how you actually address the effects of both moorings and anchoring. Submissions were also received around the Tahuroa mooring area, which has now been recommended to be called the Port of Tahuroa mooring area, and that's in response to the submissions from Tahuroa Iron Sands Limited. I'll just briefly and I now know you've got the presentations in front of you, but I'll just touch on some of those recommendations. So the objectives are being recommended to be retained as notified. The Port of Tahuroa mooring area is now shown in Schedule 2 and correctly named and included on the maps. And for those that aren't familiar with the Port of Tahuroa, there is an example and photographs of the mooring buoy shown in the evidence, I think, of Mr. Goodacre for Tahuroa Iron Sands Limited. The amendments that are being suggested to Rule 4 and to Policy 6 are to include anchoring associated with regionally significant infrastructure and to allow anchoring in Civer A areas in the duration of that anchoring. So the definition of anchoring has been amended or recommended to be amended to delete the 7-day requirement and to instead ensure that that's placed across the relevant rules and that's included in the mooring chapter. Just in terms of, I guess, those matters of contention, Slipper Island Residents Association in their submission did voice concern about access to the island. They didn't specifically seek wording changes or new provisions. However, we've interpreted their decision to be that they wish to maintain the ability to be able to anchor and to also use their existing moorings. I note that they're not asking to be heard or haven't asked to be heard and not appearing, but that may be a matter that the panel wish to have a closer look at. The only other possible matter in contention, and again, I'm not sure, I don't think the Whangaroa Environmental Defence Society are asking to be heard either, is they did raise an issue about the proximity of the Raglan mooring area with Raglan Wharf. So Raglan Wharf has recently been upgraded. There is a mooring area that's been there for some time, and it's the same mooring area under the operative plan. And they did raise concern about the safety and collisions of vessels at night. However, as set out in my Section 42A report, the Harbour Master, the Regional Harbour Master, Chris Bredenbeck, was not aware of that issue, has not received any complaints, and as far as he's concerned, it isn't an issue. But that is a matter that had been raised. Otherwise, I'm pretty confident that all other matters are resolved. Just in terms of Slipper Island, just a little bit more detail there, and you'll see that there was a Section 32AA evaluation done of the three options. One was to leave things as they are. The second one was to rely on the navigation safety bylaw, and the third one was to provide for anchoring. The situation that would occur otherwise with the notified plan wording is that essentially every time someone wanted to anchor at Home Bay or South Bay, they would need to get a resource consent from the council. And anchoring is a temporary activity that may last only for a matter of an hour or a few hours or a couple of days, and that seemed both impractical and impossible to achieve. So now the recommendation and the wording have been reflected in the policy and in the rule is that the intent is to avoid or minimise disturbance or damage to those seagrass beds. So there has been some scientific work done. There was a report that was done looking at the potential impacts on the seagrass beds, as well as looking at the extent of those seagrass beds. So they have grown. The last survey was done in 2018, and I'm informed by Mike Townsend, the team leader for the science at the Regional Council, that they will do some further monitoring around ongoing potential impacts of anchoring on the seagrass beds. But the report itself didn't conclusively say that there were significant adverse effects, or those adverse effects were from anchoring. And indeed, as shown, I think in the photo that I put in the Section 42A report, any effects are very immediate to the chain itself. So that's just an example where seagrass beds are part of the CIVA A areas, obviously are important, are significant, but equally there is a need to ensure that mooring and anchoring can continue. And realistically, in talking with the Harbour Master, there aren't other options, or there are no other options to provide for that anchoring in particular. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Stelios, any questions?
Just a couple. Thank you, Mr. Fazekli. Just so mooring management areas are typically in areas which are sheltered, and which are also popular for itinerant boaties to undertake anchoring and so on. In the licensing system that's proposed, is there a way to ensure efficient allocation so that essentially people with moorings don't, if they're not using them, that space is available?
Yeah, my understanding is the maritime team are aware of making sure that the space is used as efficiently as possible, including looking at different types of mooring systems. So they do undertake regular writing and correspondence with mooring owners and inspections to make sure that mooring owners are complying and are using them. I think by using the licensing regime, it's much easier to forfeit a mooring and ensure it's being used by someone else.
Thank you.
The difficulty I think that arises if someone's paying their annual fee, the expectation is that they will be using that mooring.
Thank you.
So at the moment, technically, there's not illegal anchoring going on at Slipper Island with those seagrass beds, is there? Probably.
No, there's no illegal mooring. So,
In terms of the existing provisions in the plan, yeah, with all that seagrass there.
yeah, so currently under the operative plan, there are 2 moorings at Home Bay and 9 moorings at South Bay,
Yep.
and those are consented.
Yeah,
and
but
then-
the anchoring that goes on there is probably...
Yes, and then under the current operative plan, anchoring is a permitted activity.
Okay, so yeah, okay.
So, yeah, I guess the recognition of there being seagrass beds isn't currently in the operative plan.
Yep. Yeah,
So that's one of the, I guess, I wouldn't say unintended, but one of the consequences of identifying the significant Indigenous biodiversity areas and
That makes
mapping
sense,
those
yeah.
in the plan.
Just a couple for me, but just on the issue, it's always difficult, isn't it? I mean, in the sense of someone comes along, puts down an anchor, and they don't know that the area is important. So there is a whole practicality which runs with all of these provisions. But I understand what you were suggesting in terms of your recommendation. Just mind, were there any new mooring areas in the proposed plan? There are new ones. So in any of the existing ones taken away? They were modified. I know some were modified.
My understanding, I think there may have been one possibly in Kawhia Harbour. There was some rationalisation.
Kawhia, the moorings area in Kawhia has been managed under a licensing system by the navigation safety team as a trial. I don't think if there were any more. Yeah, there was one mooring area taken away, but it only had one mooring in it.
Right, okay.
It was for I think it was for some purpose, but it was realised a consent would be more efficient,
Right, to deal
given
with
the
it.
change to licensing
Thank you.
and
Again,
the single purpose.
it's all just contextual. But in terms of Slipper Island, which doesn't have a mooring area, but it's just got some consented moorings, was there consideration given, do you know, to actually make it a mooring area, particularly for those 9?
That was before my time and before the regional harbour master at the time. I have asked that question. We don't seem to have information around that. So there was consultation undertaken on other mooring areas, but I can look into that further.
Well, no, I'm not. I'm just saying. I mean, there isn't one. It's not now, and as you're saying, no one's really asked for one, so I don't have scope to include it. I was just sort of trying to working through the Slipper Island people. I mean, I'm surprised that they might not have said, well, given the issues for us, can you please give us a mooring management area? It doesn't seem that that's come through.
No, in reading their submission, what they're essentially saying is we're happy with the status quo.
Like, yeah, just leave us
We
alone.
just want to make sure that that will continue, that both residents and visitors to the island can either moor or anchor
Yeah.
to be able to access the island.
As you say, there are very few submissions on this chapter, and again, I think you expressed some surprise, so did I, and I suppose Mr. Learstone does too, and moorings often is a highly controversial issue in terms of allocation of space, and I want more space and people should have less, so there are a few submissions to deal with.
If I may, just in the context of what was consulted on, was the licensing of moorings raised in consultation?
Yes, it was.
It
Yes,
was.
that was a major.
Yeah, and just around that, was there any thoughts or anything, feedback on insurance for those mooring holders? And I just think for the regional council, the issue that we're finding around derelict vessels.
I don't think that was consulted on or sought feedback on, no.
And nothing was raised through submissions by the look of it either.
I'd need to go back on the consultation record and just check. It's not triggering anything from my memory, but I can have a look at the consultation record for each of the mooring areas.
Thanks, Dave.
Certainly seemed more efficient within a mooring management area which has been identified as appropriate for moorings. is to allow a licensing regime for the harbour master to decide what is the most appropriate vessels, big, small, whatever, than trying to specify the numbers. I remember Auckland and Hugh, Mr. Lewis, I remember that Auckland specified numbers and then took them out. Says, well, it is much more efficient to identify the area as being appropriate and then manage it through a different process, which is more flexible.
I have had to, Greg, just around the basis of with sand movement in harbour and that some moorings are actually shifting, which would mean a change to that consent. So just that flexibility within the rule.
Makes sense, yeah.
Yes, I was going to concur with that statement as well, that they want that flexibility, or the maritime want that flexibility. So if they do have to move a mooring, also while there were numbers in the operative plan, again, if you can make more efficient use of the space and if an area for 30 mooring berths can actually take 40, then that's probably a better outcome rather than allowing moorings elsewhere. I think the other element is by having the prohibited mooring areas, you're then very clearly sending a signal that vessels are to be provided for within the mooring areas. And so again, that supply and demand was looked at as well in terms of ensuring that there would be capacity for at least the next 10 years through both the licensing system and through the plan.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kia good afternoon.
Kia ora tātou. I'm called Susan Brennan, tōku ingoa. My name's Susan Brennan and I am the Section 42 author for the Natural Hazards chapter. So, here we go. Basically, the Natural Hazards chapter was developed to reflect the requirements of the NZCPS and the RPS and to implement them more fully based. So it's adopted a risk management approach, and it requires the planning for 100 years as per the NZCPS. It focuses on not increasing risk and encouraging adaptation that reduces risk. So the policy direction of this chapter is to discourage hard protection structures, because obviously hard protection structures are one of the key CMA type structures that relate to natural hazards that people are really interested in. It's obviously a first response to a threat. So this policy direction is following the NZCPS and discouraging them, but also acknowledging that they do have a role in existing communities and existing developed areas. But it's not possible to say that they're appropriate forever. So this risk management approach is looking at identifying that they might be there for a term, but we can't say that they're the right response forever. The role of this long-term adaptive management plans is where this sort of thing would be teased out, which is as well looking at the community-based assessing of where we go, where you go, and so that is considered to be the best way of considering the long-term risk. And the natural hazard matters, we talked about them in the planning expert conferencing session on the 4th of December. And so there are some changes made as a consequence of that. As an introduction, the natural hazards chapter contains the objectives and policies relating to natural hazards, but the rules are implemented through the other chapters. As we talked about, the provisions give effect to the NZCPS and the RPS. I'm basically repeating exactly what I said on my first slide. But the majority of the submissions received were supportive. However, a number did seek amendments to them. I'd note that the submissions, there were none in opposition to either of the objectives or for policies 4 and 5. So they've basically, my report recommends that they get taken over and I mean, just unchanged. Of note, I'd say that I haven't put it on this slide, but policy 6 is a specific policy for flood and drainage infrastructure, existing flood and drainage infrastructure. And that is to acknowledge that at the moment, this flood and drainage infrastructure is protecting communities. And they've been in place prior to, in fact, most of the flood and drainage infrastructure isn't even in the CMA as yet. But given sea level rise, eventually it will be. Well, potentially, yes. The matters raised in submissions were was concerned that we hadn't fully recognised the NZCPS policy 27 in the place of hard protection structures. There were a few requests for amendments to definitions. There was some concern expressed by, I think it was Buffalo Beach homeowners, that the adaptive management strategy needed to acknowledge that it can involve the protection of private properties. There was also a request from Mr. Holyoake that the natural hazard risk mentions Section 73 of the Building Act, and that there was a request from the whangamata ratepayers that the natural hazard include sedimentation under mangrove specifically. The other matters raised were the implications of the policy 1 for community adaptive management strategies and how the policy links to the values of other chapters. TCDC had some concerns which we then discussed, I'll mention later on, in the expert conferencing, and we came to a resolution there which I can outline later. The Forest and Bird expressed concern that we weren't prioritising soft protection measures and sought some changes to NHP2. And then the Forest and Bird were also concerned about the focus of NHP6, which was the river and flood protection schemes, that it was not encouraging adaptation because it was giving too much support to flood and drainage schemes. Now, so the changes. The recommendations we made in response to submission, we made some amendments to the overview to clarify what the role of adaptation management strategies was in the proposed plan. I think overall there was still a lot of confusion because we're talking about CMA only. And people are really, really concerned about their communities and managed retreat. And we're not addressing that in this plan, but we do have to still acknowledge the hard protection aspect. So it's kind of one of those ones where there's that overlap with the land plan that really is needed to be clarified to make it clear, and national policy is developing at the moment in that respect about adaptation. So it'll be in August as well.
Is that the date? Because I just heard it was mid-year. Is that when the national policy statement is likely to come out on natural hazards?
That's what they've been talking about, but I think it's not.
Moving, right.
It's a moving target at the moment. Other changes we made, we amended some of the terminology in the provisions using clause 16.2 of Schedule 1 because we'd made, or I had made some references to precise hire strategy policy numbers, and the Minister of Conservation was not happy about that because they can change, so legitimately. So we changed some of those, and some of the terminology was, we just tightened it a bit to make it clearer, basically. That's all in my Section 42A report. There were some amendments made to NHP2 to refocus the policy on where hard protection might be appropriate, and in response to, I think it was the Regional Council said that I'm not sure which one it is. Yes, the Regional Council wanted to remove reference to the effects on Schedule 4, 7 and 8 sites because those values are addressed in other chapters, and so they didn't need to be repeated in the natural hazards section because the plan is to be read as a whole. There were some environmental law initiative requested that that their concerns about NHP 6. We thought that there was some merit in what they were saying, and so we suggested that there would be a slight rewording to more clearly reflect the need to assess the viability of adaptive management options and not simply the scheme viability itself, because obviously we need to make sure that environmental and public risks and costs and benefits were considered. So there was some rewording proposed to address that. The recommendations after expert conferencing and talking with Thames Coromandel District Council in particular, they pointed out that in NHP1, the reference to excluding hard protection structures actually made it very hard for their adaptation planning, because that's part of it, and that they felt that it wasn't appropriate because it also put it into a harder basket. So we agreed with that, and so we removed that reference, but we noted that the use and development shouldn't be in creating a future demand for more hard protection structures is a valid consideration for that adaptation planning. And we also recommended that a new policy be put into IM, which was IMP 18A, which was the climate change emergency response and recovery work that often needs to be done after a major incident. It was to give some policy support to recognize that those response and recovery actions are necessary.
It was actually coming from Waikato District, wasn't it, I think?
It was, yes it was, sorry, it was Waikato District, yes it was.
Oh, Waikato
Jane.
District, sorry, yeah.
And, that was to give some policy support if any resource consents came up in that matter, so, to acknowledge that there are response and recovery issues. And this was resolved at the planning expert conferencing on the 4th. That matter was resolved. And the matters remaining in some of these, they're because I haven't been able to speak the people haven't come to part or supplied evidence, so I labelled them as matters remaining. There was the Buffalo Beach homeowners, the role of adapted management strategies in relation to private property. The Mr. Hollyoak's request to have the Section 73 of the Building Act. So I've recommended against that, and for the reasons outlined in the Section 42A report, but that, you know, he might like to speak to that. And there's also we removed the references in NHP2 to the Schedule 4, 7 and 8 sites on the request of the Waikato Regional Council operational team. And then Historic Heritage, NHPT asked to have historic heritage sites included in that, but we'd already taken it out. So on the basis that it's still covered, and I know that they're not particularly happy with that either. So. And basically, that concludes my presentation.
Questions for Ms.
Just want to thank you, Ms. Brennan. The policy direction for the discouragement of hard protection structures. Now, I think hard protection structures, in my mind, there's a spectrum of hard protection structures, and you can start at the sort of the softer end of hard protection, which blends in with the natural environment, through to something which is quite different to the natural environment. Do you think that the policy direction that you've got is picking up that continuum? And I'm thinking about some examples for in the Auckland region, where, for example, there's an artificial headland at the end of Kaimarama Beach, which the beach has been replenished, and there's an artificial headland. Now that artificial headland has been sculpted to look like natural rocks. And another example is along the Tamaki River, there are areas where there's been coastal erosion, and rather than putting in a rock face, there's been a reconstitution of existing in situ material, which blends more naturally into the into that coastal environment. And so, just wondering how the policy direction in here picks up on those sorts of nuances between in that continuum from soft hard structures through to hard structures.
The wording used reflects the NZCPS, which does discourage them. But there is also, in disturbance and deposition, there's also a policy there that supports soft protection. I haven't got it written down which one that is. I think discourage is just saying you need to pass a test. And I would say that the test that we're requiring here too, which is looking at the long-term adaptation, looking at the options, looking at the costs and benefits, etc., allow for the consideration of alternatives. Do you know? So you can, one of the alternatives could be a 50-foot wall that is clearly cuts everybody off from the beach and is unacceptable, but man, it's going to protect and protect the thing behind. But it's not going to meet the other things. So one of these, of your soft, hard protection ones, you could say, well, this is reducing the effect on the natural environment and the natural processes, but meets these other things, and that would be part of that assessment, I'm assuming.
Yes, I think I'm trying to make sure that there's a good policy direction there to the consideration of the natural character, public access, along with the necessity in some circumstances to protect with a hard structure.
Yeah, and this is just reflecting that the hard structure might be all right for the next 20 or 30 years, or maybe even 50, but in 100 years' time, if sea level continues to rise, it might no longer be.
Thank you.
I guess sort of a bit related to that question, You talked, and I think you mentioned the Buffalo Beach Homeowners Association, the role of adaptive management strategies in relation to private property. Was there concerns about the concept of adaptive management, or more perhaps the speed of adaptation, for want of a better description?
I think they were concerned that when you're saying it's a community adaptation plan, that it meant that private people couldn't be involved, and that it wasn't reflecting the fact that TCDC have adopted some of their, I think their wall is part of their adaptation management plan, but then it's part of a community one, so it's okay. You know, I think they were sort of thinking that it could only be a community thing, but if the community itself, the community long-term adaptive management plan, includes what they've got, then it is a community one. It doesn't have to only be protecting public assets.
Okay, so there's a bit of
I think it was just a little bit of
going on
confusion.
there.
Yeah.
Okay. So, so potential for resolution going forward.
The issue there is that the private walls, you know, people that have come in and put in private walls have created problems for their neighbours.
Yep.
And so this focus was more about getting the community together to decide this is the way we're going.
Yeah. Okay. Yep.
Thank you. Nothing further from me. Again, natural hazards was a vexed topic.
Hello again.
You're getting dizzy.
This time, the presentation will address the noise and vibrations chapter, or noise in short. Permitted noise rules, particularly noise R1, are key issues in contention in this chapter. Expert conferencing on these issues took place as part of the planning session on the 4th of December, and further amendments are recommended in the Section 42A addendum report. In rebuttal evidence, experts representing NZTA and marinas confirmed their support for the amendments recommended for noise R1, and so the matters associated with noise generated from regionally significant infrastructure and marinas are now considered resolved. So as an introduction, the noise chapter is an activity-based chapter of the proposed plan. And integrated management is promoted when it comes to the control of noise, because WRC is responsible for noise emissions and mitigating the effects of noise generated within the CMA only. This chapter contains provisions that cover airborne and underwater noise. And in addition to the noise rules in this chapter, other relevant regulations include Section 16 of the RMA, which the operative coastal plan largely relies on, because permitted activities under the operative plan don't have to comply with any specific noise standards. And the proposed noise chapter is a departure from the operative plan in this regard by imposing limits, including through permitted activity standards. And these noise level standards have been determined with input from experts from Marshall Day Acoustics. Also of relevance is the Waikato Navigation Safety Bylaw, which regulates recreational vessels, including applying a speed limit of 5 knots outside of certain zones within 200 metres of the coast. The Marine Mammal Protection Notice prohibits seismic surveying within the West Coast North Island marine mammal sanctuary, and where permitted, seismic surveying must be undertaken in accordance with the DOC Code of Conduct. In submission, there were 6 key matters raised. Firstly, no changes are recommended in response to submissions seeking to expand the scope of the chapter to cover activities outside the CMA. Because the function of regional councils is restricted to the coastal marine area of the region. Secondly, submitters sought new provisions to address the effects of noise from helipads in the CMA, motorbike noise on beaches, and other activities that are not currently addressed. No new provisions are recommended because the policy framework in the noise chapter addresses all adverse effects from noise, irrespective of the noise generating activity. Thirdly, infrastructure providers sought to provide for RSI, which the 42A report recommended to include in noise P3 for underwater noise, but noise associated with RSI is not recommended to be a permitted activity under noise R1. The remaining 3 matters are in contention. Firstly, timber power driving, which I'll explain in detail shortly, is recommended to be managed under a new permitted activity rule, noise R1A. A number of submitters sought amendments to address the effects of noise on marine fauna and birds. The 42A report agreed to amendments to noise P1 and the advisory note under noise P4. And Forest and Bird in particular was concerned about the effects of noise on birds. However, the 42A report didn't accept their submissions on noise policy 2, rule 1 and rule 2 because restricting noise associated with recreational vessels and other permitted activities, for example, the operation of, say, highways, and bird breeding, roosting and nesting areas is considered overly restrictive. However, I did agree to insert a new condition under permitted activity rule noise R3 for temporary military training activities, so that adverse effects on ecological values can be managed through a discretionary consent if these are to be undertaken under SIBA A. I also agreed with the New Zealand Defence Force that weapons firing and blasting can be managed under the same permitted activity rule, but it shouldn't take place in the marine mammal sanctuary. The 42A addendum reports also recommended a number of minor amendments to improve clarity and consistency. No amendments are recommended to address the impact of high-frequency anti-fouling technology on the basis that there is limited information on this emerging technology. And this aligns with the view of the marine biologist expert from the Department of Conservation. So for timber power driving, I've considered submitted evidence, additional advice from Marshall Day Acoustics, expert conferencing, and also pre-hearing meeting. And the Section 42A addendum report recommend that underwater noise generated from timber power driving is managed under noise R1A. And this permitted rule balances the advice from Marshall Day Acoustics and experts from DOC. While timber power driving generally doesn't need mitigation or management measures to address the effects of underwater noise, some general best practice guidelines are in place. So in condition 2, noise R1A therefore requires piloting to stop if any marine mammal, penguin, or other diving bird is observed surfacing within 50 meters from the piling operation. there could be some contention regarding this 50-metre monitoring zone, but I believe this is the most pragmatic way of avoiding and minimising any effects on marine fauna in the absence of site-specific assessments. Is there anything you'd like to know more about noise?
Is there? Stu?
I guess the only thing that jumped into my mind, so if I've understood it clearly, it's only the underwater impacts of timber pile driving that are permitted. The above ground is still require a consent, because I've said it's been crossed out from R1, is that correct?
Yes. One of the reasons we decided to exclude timber pile driving from R1 is that it would mean that both airborne and underwater noise are permitted activities.
Yep.
The intention was only to exclude underwater noise from assessment. And pile driving is generally part of other activities,
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Which would come under the rule that applied to that activity.
So the only thing that sort of strikes me is that taking the time to observe a marine mammal, penguin or other diving bird, etc., requires a specific bit of effort, which the guys doing the pile driving may not be have the time to do, if that makes sense. But I'm assuming that DOC and Co that were involved in this process have considered all that.
So the condition requires a dedicated observer.
Oh, it does, okay.
In my
Oh, of course, yep, okay, yep. Thank you.
Just following up on that wording of the dedicated observer, does that person need to have any sort of specific qualifications, or can it be a member of the construction crew? I know I've seen other provisions where they have required an ecologist with experience, suitably qualified, in that area to observe, or a marine mammal observer type condition, but that just refers to a dedicated observer. So what's your interpretation of a dedicated observer? What sort of person would that be?
The intention is that someone from the construction team can undertake that role. And I've seen in some consents for primarily steel power driving that with a much larger monitoring zone, that a person with specific qualifications, for example on marine mammals, are required to undertake the observation role because they might need special equipment or elevated position or someone who's specially trained to identify marine mammals. But in this case, I think for a 50-metre monitoring zone, it is a member of the construction team can adequately undertake that role, and based on our advice from Marshall Day Acoustics, this a 50-metre zone would be sufficient for any foreseeable effects from timber pile driving.
And so that's 50 metres from the source of the noise, circle effectively.
It would be from the site, from where timber pile driving is undertaken.
Is this encouraging then an observer to chase an animal out of the area?
No, so the activity is supposed to stop until if you do see a mammal or penguin or other diving birds, the activity is supposed to stop until they have left.
I understand the pile driving is supposed to stop, but time's money, and I would imagine that that crew would want to get that bird, that mammal out of that area as quickly as possible. I just wonder about the practicality of something sort of as broad as that. One, having someone with the ability to spot it, and then two, you're going to want to remove it from the site, so to speak. Just the consequence, possibly.
I think, just picking up that, I think what we're raising in here, I mean, this only relates to timber pile driving, not to other matters. And I think you've already said it kind of, I mean, pile driving is going to start from above the water, down the water. So you've got consent above, permitted underneath, and you've got these rules, like the one we've just been talking about the 50 metres, and the in-water piling does not occur in poor visibility. I think the issue we're probably raising is this whole certainty argument, and how do you actually ensure this as a permitted activity?
You do raise a good point. So the airborne noise is part of the consent. It still requires assessment, and it may be other conditions attached. The intention of this, of permitting underwater noise associated with timber pile driving is, so our acoustic experts from Marshall Day, they have been undertaking noise assessments under the Auckland Unitary Plan rules for over 10 years, and they have consistently found that no mitigation or management measures have been needed to address the effects of underwater noise from timber pile driving. So the intention is to focus the consenting on activities that are more likely to generate more adverse effects, which is steel pile driving.
There's a bit of way to go on this. I think you put to us where you've got to. I think we're raising issues about whether that's the most appropriate, but that's for down the track.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. Oh, I'm doing the next one.
Yes, you're next as well. Thank you.
Public access and recreation. So public access and recreation is a values-based chapter that addresses public access and the use of public open space in the coastal marine area. Submissions are largely supportive of this chapter. The Section 42A report recommends additional clauses inserted into PA P3 to clarify where a restriction of walking access may be appropriate. No evidence was received from submitters on this chapter, and no expert conferencing was held. The PA chapter contains provisions that seek to maintain and enhance public access to, along and through the CMA, which is recognised under Section 6D of the RMA as a matter of national importance. Provisions also address public use and recreation of public open space, including for cultural practices, and provisions allow restriction of public walking access only in exceptional circumstances. Integrated management between the regional council, territorial authorities and communities is needed when determining appropriate routes or levels of public access, because WSE is responsible for managing public access within the CMA only, and this relies on access to the coast, and a regional coastal plan can't regulate access to the coast above Mihai Water Springs, which is the responsibility of territorial authorities. This chapter doesn't contain rules, and the provisions are implemented through activity rules and other chapters of the proposed plan. That is to say, any use and development in this EMA is expected to consider its impact on free, safe and practical public access and the ability to use and enjoy areas of public open space. Noting there is general support for the chapter, there are 5 key matters raised in submissions. Firstly, provisions in the PA chapter are not intended to result in additional restrictions on tangata whenua access to the CMA, and therefore no changes are recommended in this regard. Secondly, I recommend not inserting a spatial layer showing public land because, and Mr. Fazaklia touched on this subject this morning, this would primarily show land outside the jurisdiction of the proposed plan, and also the proposed plan doesn't have specific provisions that manage activities on public land, and so this layout would be for information only, and as originally mentioned, the Outdoor Access Commission website already contains a public access area map online. I also recommend PA, P1 and P2 are retained as notified because they are consistent with the NZCPS. Policy 3 sets out the list of purposes that can justify a restriction of public walking access, and this matter could still be in contention. However, no evidence from submitters were received on this matter. We received submissions seeking additional clauses in Policy 3 where a restriction on public walking access to, along and adjacent to the CMA may be allowed. I consider public walking access could be restricted to avoid or reduce conflicts with activities of landowners or occupiers, because this is in line with the direction in the RPS. I also recommend adding an advisory note, even though this is common knowledge, to clarify that any access over private land requires the permission of the landowner. As for managing biosecurity risks, although this is not explicitly provided for under the NZCPS, it is a significant threat to Indigenous biodiversity, which justifies a restriction on walking access. And given the importance of pest management in the Waikato, I recommend this is specifically mentioned under PAP3. This concludes the presentation on public access.
Thank you. Questions?
Thank you. I haven't got my head around PAP3 6 that you just mentioned, avoid or reduce conflicts. So only allow restriction of public access if it's necessary to reduce or avoid conflicts with activities of landowners. Could you give an example of what that would look like? Because I just can't get my head around it.
Yep, sure. This was a submission from Federated Farmers, New Zealand, and also I believe the intention was, for farming activities, health and safety of visitors. For example, if you were moving stock in the CMA and public access to that area would need to be temporarily restricted, and that would be one of the instances where public access could be restricted.
Right.
Yeah.
It kind of feels a bit like straying into territorial authority sort of areas a little bit. Yeah, because my recollection from the provisions for moving stock in the CMA, it was only occasionally when there was no other option, rather than not something you do on a weekly basis sort of thing. But yeah, to me it's something I want to look at a bit closer later on. But thank you.
Just that same provision actually in terms of the activities of landowners or occupiers, and it's not qualified in any way in terms of adjacent landowners or occupiers or adjoining, and just wondered if that was, sort of intentional. Some obviously landowners have riparian rights down to the water. Is it limited to those, or does anyone that owns a farm and thinks, oh well, it'd be quicker to just go down the water and go through the CMA to move my stock, would that wording mean that they could do that and exclude the public from it?
I believe the wording of this policy is it gives effect to the policy 7 in the IM chapter of the RPS, which says public access to and along the coastal marine area will only be restricted where necessary, and one of the instances is to avoid conflicts with activities of landowners or occupiers. So I guess this policy was to specifically give effect to that clause, and whether we need a qualifier to say avoid or reduce conflicts with activities of landowners or occupiers adjacent to the CMA or adjacent to the activity being undertaken. Yeah, I might have to come back to you.
That's
on
fine.
that.
I just wanted to raise the
Yeah.
question now for you to think about.
Again, I think it would be useful to reflect on that, because I agree with the other commissioners, landowners and or occupiers, because you've made it quite clear public access, you're only dealing with public access within the coastal marine area. And I know there's this issue about integrated management and cross-border boundaries, but even the header, when you've got in there, which is not subject to submission, I think, adjacent to the coastal marine area, seems to imply the policy is not just the coastal marine area. And I accept that some property boundaries and that do go down into the coastal marine area because of old title and erosion, all those sorts of things. And I'm just offering the suggestion, I'm wondering whether what you're really concerned about or raising is that there are potential conflict with other existing or lawful activities, as opposed to specifying landowners and occupiers. So there may be another way through there.
Yes, yeah, happy to give that more.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's what happens when we get into these chapters where there's a few changes, we can focus on them.
Yeah.
Thank you. Welcome back.
Kia ora anō tātou. So my final presentation today is just to provide a summary overview of key matters relating to sites and areas of significance to Māori, or SASM in short. So in terms of the SASM chapter, So the SASM chapter is a new chapter in the plan alongside Schedule 6 and the SASM map player. In terms of the submissions, I think we received about 33 submissions. A lot of them seeking to retain the provisions. It is quite a small chapter, but just noting it's quite important to tangata whenua, given that it seeks to manage and protect SASM within the CMA. I note that there's only one matter remaining in contention, and that's from Transpower New Zealand, seeking to delete the phrase adjacent to from SASM P1. So as previously mentioned, the SASM chapter includes provisions aimed at protecting sites, places and features of historical, cultural and spiritual significance to tangata whenua. Just noting as well that when viewing the SASM chapter, to consider also the tangata whenua provisions from the IM chapter. It also serves to provide certainty to resource users regarding known information related to SASM. So Schedule 6 doesn't identify all known SASM in the CMA, but it provides that starting point, also recognising that SASM P4 and SASM P6 allows for tangata whenua to identify additional SASM through the consenting process. And also just mentioning that crossover again between Schedule 6 and Schedule 5, where some SASM from Schedule 6 is also recognised in Schedule 5 as cultural sites, specifically Wāhi Tapu and Urupa. So in terms of the development of Schedule 6, we used the ASCV layer from the operative plan, so that's the areas of significant conservation value as a starting point. And then we used iwi public information such as iwi management plans, treaty deeds, settlements, to compile Schedule 6. In terms of key matters and recommendations, some submitters sought to extend the scope of SASM policies to include the appropriate management of SASM located on private land. In my Section 42A report, I noted that this was out of scope, but the tangata whenua chapter, as well as iwi management plans, provides that guidance in relation to engaging with tangata whenua and guidance in particular in relation to SASM. There were also submissions from the aquaculture industry to amend the SASM map layer or the SASM schedule to recognise that existing marine farms do not compromise SASM values. I believe that this was a decision sought across all layers, and I rejected these submission points on the basis that when Schedule 6 was compiled, this consideration wasn't undertaken, nor did we engage with tangata whenua on this particular matter. In terms of recommendations on this topic, it was just minor amendments to correct minor errors in both Schedule 6 and the SASM map layer. In terms of matters remaining contention, Transpower New Zealand seeks to delete the phrase adjacent to from SAS and P1. In their rebuttal evidence, they noted concerns with the phrase adjacent to and its uncertainty, given that SAS and P1, or the strike-through version now, applies to both identified and unidentified sites. I initially rejected the submission point. However, after reviewing the submitter's evidence, I now changed my position and agree with their point, as it would be difficult for consent applicants to prove this test if, given that SAS and P1 would now apply to both identified and unidentified sites. And so I'll be noting that in my closing submission, and that's the proposed change there.
That's helpful. Thank you for being upfront about that, and experts change their position. That's very good to know.
Yeah, he pātai tāku. I don't know if it's for you or it's more broad, but in some of the chapters, there's a recommendation to delete the word areas. So at the moment we've got the schedule, which is sites and areas of significance to Māori, and then some of the authors have recommended deleting the word areas. Some haven't. So we've got sites or areas, we've got sites and areas, we've got sites of significance. So I'm a little bit confused as to the rationale. From your perspective, you're not recommending any changes in this chapter. It's still using the sites and areas of significance to Māori. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Have you considered the changes made to the other chapters where there have been recommendations to drop the and areas or change it, and there's other areas where it says all areas, and how that fits with your chapter?
Yes, but I suspect these other two might want to chip in. My understanding is that regarding when it comes to rules, we need definite information, and so hence my understanding is why there was the recommendation to remove areas as it was too broad. And yeah, so it depends on the policy direction, I guess. With your rules, it would probably be referring to sites, but if it's broader policy direction, then I think would be the sites and areas of significance.
And it may be that it's addressed shortly. There were two policies in particular where it was dropped out, the and areas. And then there's references throughout where it goes sites or areas of significance referred to in Schedule 6, which Schedule 6 is sites and areas. So, yeah, just a bit of clarity on what we're actually referring to would be.
I can report back to you on that. That's...
Oh, good, thanks. Just a couple for me, I think. Probably fewer questions around your view on this adjacent to, but in terms of your first slide, where you've got some of the sites of significant to Māori listed in the Schedule 6, also historic heritage sites in Schedule 5, and just relating back to that and what was it, I think, yes, you told us about historic heritage and heritage or HPT's concern about ground truthing. Does that cross over into these sites? Is Heritage New Zealand raising issues about ground truthing these culturally significant sites, or they haven't gone that far?
No, my understanding that hasn't gone that far.
Right. Okay. So there's not submissions before us saying prior to the hearing panel recommending these go in that they need to be ground truth. So it's not before us, unlike Heritage New Zealand's other provisions.
No, not in relation to
Okay.
SASM.
Right. Good. Thank you. Good to know. Thank you very much. I mean, we're going to take a break now for 10 or 15 minutes, and in that, because we've got two more officers, we've got Ms Yang back and Mr Vizakli, and we've got the team who potentially could come tomorrow. I've got to talk to Mr Rice, so I think we're looking potentially about moving submitters forward if we can. if we continue with the officers who are going to be heard tomorrow, we've got Ms Brennan, who is here, and then Mr Mackenzie seems to not be here now, I don't think, and there's Ms Wicks and Mr Bentley from Boffers, who were they intending to come down in person?
No, they were going to be available
online. Right.
If there were questions, I mean,
Right.
if there's no questions, we can excuse them.
Right.
However, they would be online at 9 o'clock tomorrow.
Right. So I just have a discussion. After afternoon tea, I'll come back and we'll come decide where we're going to go. But I was talking to Mr Rice about where we're at right now. But Council, are you happy to continue with the team who are coming today, if we can?
Yes,
Right, okay, right.
I've spoken to Ms Brennan and she's comfortable to do
Right, and then
this afternoon, if that would assist you.
well,
Obviously, tomorrow was what she was planning on, but if it would assist this afternoon.
Given I don't think it would be that scary, I don't think that overnight you've been sort of stressing overnight, thinking, oh my goodness. And it may be fine to have Mr Mackenzie can come tomorrow if that's going to suit. Otherwise, if the boffer, because of the boffer people.
Yes, I mean, Mr Mackenzie is based in Hamilton. We can see if he'll be available later this afternoon, but
it's the boffer people.
It's the boffer people who weren't available today.
Exactly. So all right, well, let's take the break. I'll talk to Mr Rice and we'll come back and I'll talk to the panel over. Mr Vazaki.
Yeah, sorry, Mr Chair, just as a matter of process, discussing at lunchtime with Mr McAuliffe, obviously there's been some matters that were raised this morning and again, most recently, of Ms Tai and Ms Yang. Are you comfortable to have a verbal response to particular matters, or would you prefer a written response? And we also have things like the river and mouth boundary agreement to provide to you, but it may require some written context around that, and conscious that other parties may be interested to be on the hearings panel.
Let me talk to the panel because as soon as something's written now, then we have to make that publicly available now and other parties to comment on it. And so it depends on when it comes and then who's going to comment on it. Versus we're going to hear from other submitters, and when we come to hear those submitters, we specifically go back and ask the 42A officer to respond to that question. Versus things coming up in reply. So I don't think there's a straight answer to that. So I'll just check in with the panel.
Yes, because I was going to say in terms of the question around PAP3, I think that would be best addressed in the officer's reply, having heard any other additional submissions presented. In terms of the river and mouth boundary agreements, and we have got the documents to share, but there were some questions this morning that I think do probably benefit from a written response.
Yeah, we'll just check in and I'll come back and raise that issue as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think it really comes down to fundamentally, do we need that information now to assist us to the next stage, or is it stuff that can come later? Is the issue. Okay, well, let's take a break we'll come back, just because I've got a few things. Why don't we, let's just say 5 to 4, and